Welcome back to another episode of Dazed and Apologize, where we help you navigate culture's questions with faith and reason. So today is really part two of an episode that we started last week about God and evil, asking the question, why would a good God allow so much suffering? So if you haven't watched the first episode, I really encourage you to go back and check that one out before you tune into this one, because in this one, I'm going to lay out an explanation that I think is rational and is good for explaining how a good God can allow suffering. So just to refresh your memory, though, from last week, the problem is if God allows evil and suffering in this world because he cannot stop it, then he may be good, but he's not all-powerful because he can't stop it. On the other hand, if God allows evil and suffering, even though he could stop it, but he doesn't want to, or he won't stop it, then maybe he's all-powerful, but he's not good. He doesn't really want to stop it. And so therefore, the conclusion that people draw is that the all-powerful, good, all-knowing, all of that stuff, God of the Bible that Christians believe in and claim to exist, does not exist, or else there would not be all this evil and suffering in the world. And then just to refresh your memory too, last week we talked about the different theodicies. Now, a theodicy is a way of reconciling the existence of evil with a all-good, all-knowing, all-powerful God. So a theodicy, last week we looked at several different theodicies and kind of how Christians throughout history have sought to explain the existence of God and evil. And we talked about Thomas Aquinas, who said that evil is really just the absence of good, or a privation. And privations are necessary for proper functioning and flourishing of society. We talked about the theodicy that simply says God is God and we're humans and we need to leave him alone. He can do whatever he wants. We should not question him. A third theodicy we talked about is one that says we don't know. We trust God, we have faith in God, his ways are not our ways, and therefore we need to just blindly, not in a negative way, but blindly trust and just have faith in him. And then we looked at the greater good theodicy, which was first put forth by St. Augustine, that said God only allows the evil in the world from which he could bring about a greater good or prevent a worse evil. Now, as with all of these theodicies, they all have some merit. There's some good that we can pull from them. Particularly for the Christians, I think there's some helpful things in there. But for the non-Christians, I think these theodicies leave some questions. Like for the greater good theodicy, we talked about where is the good. For a non-Christian who can't see the good or it's not obvious, that's a question that they have. Or what measurement is used to determine the amount of good that would counterbalance the evil that you face in your life, and who decides what is enough good to counterbalance the evil. Third question, who gets the good? Is it always the person that suffers, or is it someone else, a direct family member? Is it fair? I've had that question. Is it fair if it's not the person that suffered? You can add, when does the good come about? Is it immediate? Or what if it's 100 years later? Is that justifiable for God to allow that? Right, is that satisfactory? We talked about, those are some questions that you might have, or that your non-believing friends might have if you try to propose the greater good theodicy as a way to explain the existence of all good, all powerful, loving God with evil. And then we talked about some Bible verses such as Romans 8:28, God works together for good, all things. And we talked about 2 Corinthians 12:7, the thorn in Paul's flesh. And those are certainly wonderful verses, and they are so helpful for the Christian to have hope in suffering. And those that have a Christian worldview to help them navigate a very difficult world in light of evil and suffering and pain and difficulty. And we're going to come back to those verses later in the podcast for today. But what I want to present to you now is there is a way that I think to sufficiently reconcile the existence of evil with the existence of the God of the Bible. The omniscient, that's all-knowing, omnipotent, all-powerful, omnibenevolent, all-good God. And I mentioned this last week, and it's called the creation order theodicy. So creation order theodicy. Now I give credit to my professor in seminary, Dr. Bruce Little. He was the one that taught us this, and he wrote a book about this. It's really the prominent book out there that explains it. It's an academic work, but it is very, very thorough. So here's the definition for creation order theodicy. When God created the universe, he created it with a certain order. Now, I don't mean order like sequence, like first, second, and third. I mean order as in rules, function, structure. God created the world with those things. And a lot of those structures and rules have to do with mankind and how we operate in this world, with each other, but also with God. He gave humans and animals certain abilities and certain limitations. We know from Genesis 1:26 and 27 that we were created in the image of God, which means that we share some attributes with God. And among those attributes that we share with God is what we call libertarian freedom or moral freedom. That is that mankind, human beings, are agents of change, and we can choose between two realities. We can choose between two contrary things. We can make choices every day. Now, why is that important? Well, first and foremost, this proves that there's a good God, because the ability to choose, without the ability to choose, man cannot really love. Otherwise, we're robots. If we don't choose things in life, then we're just puppets and God's a puppet master, or we're robots or machines and God's operating machines. Now, I've used this illustration before, but if I go home with a dozen roses tonight, my wife opens the door and says, "Oh, Scott, they're so sweet. Why did you?" And I say, "My boss put a gun to my head and forced me to do this." How's my wife going to feel? Not very loved. Why? Because I didn't choose to do it. I was forced to do it. What we have to understand from the beginning here is that the choice is what makes love possible. I choose to love her. I choose to buy her flowers. I choose to stay with her. And that's loving. That is an expression of my love for her. And love, consequently, is pretty much universally accepted as one of the greatest, if not the greatest, human action. Even Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew, when asked in Matthew 22:36-40, "Teacher, what is the greatest commandment in the law?" And Jesus said, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, and your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And then the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself." Okay, so love is really the greatest act that man can do. But here's the kicker. And this is where the creation order theodicy is important, is because congruent with libertarian freedom, or alongside with the ability to choose good, man also has the choice to choose bad. The choice to do evil is congruent with the choice to do good. Because if I can choose not to love my wife, then my love for her means something. The choice to not love is what creates the choice to love. Here's an example. If there were no other women in the universe at all, no other females in existence, and I go home and say, "Baby, you're the only one for me." Well, that doesn't mean anything, because there's no other options. There's no other choice. Or in my wedding vows, what do you say at your wedding vow? You say, "I choose to love you and forsake all others." If there were no others, it's not really love. It doesn't mean anything. It's meaningless. They go hand in hand. The choice to do good comes with the choice to do bad. C.S. Lewis explained it like this: God created things which had free will. That means creatures can go wrong or right. Some people think they can imagine a creature which was free but had no possibility of going wrong. But I can't, he says. If a thing is free to be good, it must also be free to be bad. And free will then is what made evil possible. Why then did God give them free will? Because free will, although it makes evil possible, is also the only thing that makes possible any love or goodness or joy worth having. A world of automata or creatures that worked like machines would hardly be worth creating. The happiness which God designs for his higher creatures is the happiness of being freely, voluntarily united to him and each other in an ecstasy of love and delight compared with which the most rapturous love between a man and a woman on this earth is mere milk and water. And for that to happen, they've got to be free. So God created the world in a certain way with order and structure and function. And human beings have limitations and moral free choice. And because of that, though, and here's also something else, the creation order theodicy understands that God respects the rules and the laws that he set up for his creation. He respects those rules that he created. He created them in order for us to function and for us to be able to love each other and love him with our whole heart and have happiness and have joy and have peace. And he honors the rules that he set up. So what that means is if I choose to do a bad thing, because God has given me this moral freedom to choose, and because he's arranged the world in this way, that God also allows the consequences of my poor choices to be actual, real consequences. Or else the consequences of my good choices would not be real, actual consequences, would not have any real effect. Now, that does not mean that God could not intervene and stop a consequence from happening or stop multiple consequences from happening. Now, he's not obligated to do that, but he certainly could. It doesn't mean that God in his providential care could not prevent someone from getting hurt or to protect someone due to my bad, poor choices. It doesn't mean that God can't take an evil, a poor choice that someone made, and turn it into good or use it for good. I think we see this in the world every day. Experientially, we see this happen time and time again, and that's often what he does in Scripture. So now I go back to those verses like 2 Corinthians 12:7, where Paul has the thorn in the flesh. So to keep me from becoming conceited, because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations, a thorn was given me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to harass me, to keep me from being conceited. So what's happening here is Paul has a healthy perspective and realizes that this thorn in his flesh, which was given to him for the purpose of keeping him from being conceited, was given by God, and God is using this to bring about his sanctification. He's using it to grow him. And Paul's praising God for this. He's thanking God for working in his life in this way. This is discipline. This is maturity. As I said, this is sanctification. It is not really a verse to build a theodicy of why God allows all evil and suffering. Or another famous verse that's often used, and it's a great one, Genesis 50:20. This is the story after the incredibly difficult ordeal that Joseph has really in his life. He's sold into slavery by his brothers, falsely accused of sexual abuse, spent years in prison for crimes he didn't commit. It was awful. This situation was terrible. But at the end of it, Joseph says this, as for you, he's speaking to his family, as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. So this is a wonderful example of how God took some really, really bad things that happened. These things that happened to Joseph were awful, and they were the result of poor and sinful choices on the part of people, Joseph's brothers, Potiphar's wife, and others. But God stepped into this. He stepped into the order and the function that he created, and he turned the evil choices of these people, and he used them for good. And Joseph, in his maturity, he recognized that. But to form a theodicy from this is kind of dangerous. Rather, we should look at this story and see what God can do. See how God can take the evil consequences that can happen from evil choices, and we can have faith to see that God might be working behind the scenes. He could be. He probably is, and we can pray for him to be working behind the scenes. There's a wonderful book I've mentioned before, Reason for God by Timothy Keller. I highly recommend you buy this and read it. In this book, he talks about the story of Joseph. And he concludes this section in his book. It's on page 26. He says, with time and perspective, most of us can see good reasons for at least some of the tragedy and pain that occurs in life. So why couldn't it be possible that from God's vantage point, there are good reasons for all of them? So I think that's certainly possible. I think that's hopeful for us. And that's helpful for us. especially for the Christian. But again, this podcast is meant to help you navigate culture's questions. And culture's questions often comes from the non-believer, right? From the skeptic, from the atheist, from the agnostic. So when talking to a non-Christian, I think it's a fine explanation to talk about how God could be working and is often working behind the scenes to bring about good from evil. But I think the creation order theodicy doesn't lay evil at God's feet at all. It doesn't mean that God is responsible for it, that He is the cause of it. Evil in this world does not mean that God ordained it or caused it or that He even allowed it in order to bring about some greater good. Because like I said last episode, that would mean in some way the evil was necessary. The creation order theodicy simply means that evil is in this world because sinful people make some really bad choices. Now, I want to mention one critique to this, and maybe you've already been thinking of a critique to the creation order theodicy. And one of the critiques is that it takes away from the sovereignty of God, that it limits the sovereignty of God in some way. And what I want us to see is actually, if you think it through, I think it highlights the sovereignty of God. So here's an illustration to help you think this through. Now, keep in mind, no illustration is perfect, but I want you to think through this with me for a second. Think of a professor of a class at a university, okay? The professor writes the syllabus. He comes up with the syllabus. He comes up with the books that you have to read as a student. He comes up with the assignments you have to do, the essays, the interviews, the papers, whatever. He comes up with the grading scale. He may say 95 to 100 is an A. And you know, so forth and so on. So he comes up with the grading scale. He comes up with the books, the assignment. He's totally sovereign over that class, if you will. He is in charge. What he says, or she, if it's a female professor, what the professor says goes. And here's the thing. We expect the professor to honor the rules that he set up, right? If you write a paper and get a 98 on the paper, but after it's graded, the professor gives you a D, you would be mad. You'd be like, whoa, hold up. You said a 95 to 100 is an A. Well, I got a 98. So why am I getting a D? You would be mad. You would say that's not fair because you expect the professor to honor the rules in the class that he set up. He set those rules up according to what he thought was best, and you expect him to honor those. Now, of course, the professor can intervene and do something against the rules of his class. For example, if the grading scale is 95 to 100 and you got a 94, he could show you grace and he could say, you know what, I'm going to give you an A anyway. He could do that. He could intervene. But he's not going to force the class to operate a certain way in the sense that you're not puppets on a string. He's not going to force you to do something. If you sleep through a test and fail, that's going to have real consequences. Your choices in that class have real consequences. Because sometimes you're going to make choices that are not in line with the professor's wishes and desires. So that's helpful to think through with God. Yes, God created the world in such a way, and we expect Him to abide by those laws and the rules in the order that He set up. If He doesn't, we get mad. But He can intervene at any time and show us grace and love and mercy and take a bad choice that we make and change that consequence and love and protect. But we're not puppets, and He's not a puppet master. He's not forcing us to behave in a certain way. So, circling back around, I think the existence of evil does not in any way contradict the existence of the God of the Bible. An all-powerful, all-loving, all-good God. Yes, He's good. We see that creation is good. Genesis 1:31, God saw everything that He was made, and it was good. And the world that He created allows us supreme joy. It allows us happiness, and it allows us peace and so many other things. Otherwise, we're just robots. Now, as I have done with most of the podcast, I want to end with helping you how do you talk to people about this? How do you navigate having a conversation with a friend, a coworker, a family member, a teammate, a neighbor over this subject? So the first thing I think we ought to do as Christians is appreciate their question. This is a good question. These issues of evil and suffering and God, these are good questions. I think you need to empathize with them because you've probably had this question yourself, if you're honest, right? Resonate with them. There's parts of this question that you can resonate with. So take time in your conversations and in your relationships to appreciate, to value the question. It's a good question. Number two, listen to them. Many people that have this question, they have the question because they've suffered in some way. The evil world that we live in has brought about pain and suffering in their life in some way. Maybe even a tragic event has happened in their life, and they're genuinely seeking answers. So you need to love them. You need to listen to them. You need to be a shoulder they can cry on. Respect them, and remember that they're people. They're human beings with emotions, and so are you. And so it's really important to listen to them. Now, you are going to encounter people in this world that maybe haven't gone through an event or some tragic situation, and they're just curious about your answer for how does God allow suffering. But either way, listen to them. Something has brought them to the point of asking you this question. So be human and understand the emotion behind their question. Number three, I think it's important to appreciate their belief in God. Now, I say that kind of tongue in cheek because what is helpful for you to realize is really in asking this question, they're borrowing religious language. Like when they say things like just and unjust or evil, and you know, God, they even talk about God. Well, they're an atheist, and how are they making any comments about God? They don't believe in a God. But making a claim that an act is unjust. We've talked about this in a previous podcast episode for the arguments for the existence of God. To make a claim that something is unjust or something is evil, right there, you got to ask them, where does that come from? Who are you to say that something is unjust or even just? Going back to Reason for God, Tim Keller quotes C.S. Lewis. And this is in C.S. Lewis's book on how he came to faith, because, you know, he was a skeptic. And so listen to what C.S. Lewis says. He says, "My argument against God was that the universe seemed so cruel and unjust. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? Of course, I could have given up my idea of justice by saying it was nothing but a private idea of my own. But if I did that, then my argument against God collapsed too, for the argument depended on saying that the world was really unjust, not simply that it did not happen to please my private fancies. Consequently, atheism turns out to be too simple." So he goes on later to say, the only reason we know a stick is crooked is because we have a straight stick. So you compare something bad in this world, and you're whether you know it or not, you're comparing it you're comparing it to God. He's the moral standard with which we compare everything. Now, an atheist, of course, wouldn't admit that, but that's what we're doing. Another example, and this comes from this book as well, Martin Luther King Jr., in his letters from a Birmingham jail, argues that the only way we can know that a human law is unjust if there is a higher law to compare it to. So he's talking about racism and the sin of racism. But for him to say that's unjust, he's a human being. So a human being is saying racism is good. Racism was something that they ought to do. Well, a human being is saying it's bad. Well, they're both human beings. One is not morally superior to the other, Martin Luther King Jr. said. So who's to know who's right? Who's to know who's wrong? We're on equal footing here. He says the only way to know is you've got to compare it to a higher law. And of course, he would argue, and we would argue, I agree with him, that this is God's law. I think he's absolutely right. And so what you're doing when you're talking to somebody, kind of help them to see these things. Their worldview here is a bit problematic. It's filled with inconsistencies. They're making declarations about this world that are consistent with a Christian worldview. So help them to think through these things. Where are they getting these ideas from? And then the fourth thing, if they will let you, I think is you point them to the Bible. Specifically, the book of 1 Peter. The book of 1 Peter was written to Christians who were suffering. They were enduring persecution from outside world. And Peter writes to them to help them navigate suffering. And there's lots of verses that are incredibly helpful in the book of 1 Peter. But I want to highlight one, verses 6 and 7 of chapter 1. Peter writes, "In this you rejoice, though now for a little while, if necessary, you have been grieved by various trials." So bad things are happening to them. Trials, difficulties are happening. And in verse 7, he goes on, "So that the tested genuineness of your faith, more precious than gold that perishes though it is tested by fire, may be found to result in praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ." So what Peter's arguing here is that in the face of evil and suffering, abandoning your faith is what he's saying to do. Leaving God, blaming God, getting mad at God, abandoning your faith is not actually going to help you. It's actually going to make it worse, because the testing of your faith, these trials that are happening, are there to increase your faith, are to help your faith, are to heighten your faith in God. So it actually makes it worse if you abandon God, because you don't have that faith that can help get you through it. It actually leads you down a rabbit hole of loneliness, of isolation, of inconsistency, and of chaos. And then in light of that, I think the next thing you can do is take them further to the scriptures. Now again, to a non-believer, you want to get them to help them see how God can actually, how a belief in God, a faith in God can help them cope with evil and suffering. But if you're talking to a Christian who has these questions, these verses are providing hope and faith through suffering. So verses like 2 Corinthians 4, 16 through 18, Paul says, "We do not lose heart, though our outer self is wasting away. Our inner self is being renewed day by day. For this light momentary affliction is preparing for us an eternal weight of glory far beyond all comparison." That's encouraging. God is working behind the scenes, and we may not know it because we may not get to reap the benefits of this until later. This producing an eternal weight of glory. Or simply Matthew 28:20, Jesus says, "I will never leave you or forsake you." So you don't have to endure the suffering alone. 2 Corinthians 1, 3 through 4, God says He's the God of all comfort, who comforts us in our affliction, so that we may be able to comfort those who are in any affliction with the comfort with which we ourselves are comforted by God. 2 Corinthians 12, 9 and 10, "My grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness. For the sake of Christ, then, I am content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong." So if they will allow you, read these with them. Show them that to abandon God means none of this is true for you. So to leave God out of the equation, to neglect Him, to abandon Him, means you're in this alone. You're in this by yourself. But to come to Christ, there are promises in Scripture about suffering. And then the last thing I think that can help them is to provide them with some resources. And then there's a lot of resources out there. And one I just want to recommend, this is a book written by Matt Chandler and some folks at the Village Church in Texas. It's called Joy in the Sorrow. Joy in the Sorrow. And this is a book that, like I said, is written by folks from the Village Church. And it's written by folks from the Village Church who have gone through terrible, terrible ordeals, tragic events in their lives. And each of the chapters is a story about what happened, the tragic event that happened, the suffering that they went through. It's a difficult read in some ways, but Chandler himself had a tumor, a brain tumor. But there was a story in here about a teenage son that drowned, a wife passing away early, a stillborn daughter, a Division I athlete that I think came down with a rare bone condition and ended up ruining her career, anxiety, addiction, overdose, and grief, a 1-year-old's death, family chaos, life-threatening disease, miscarriage, and then brain tumor. Awful situations. But in each and every one of them, God showed up. God brought them joy in the sorrow. Incredibly helpful book for you to see The Bible never makes the claim that Christians will never endure suffering. It's not there. You won't find it. In fact, the Bible tells us the opposite. If you choose to follow Christ, it's going to come with suffering. It's going to come with trials. It's going to come with hardships. And for the non-Christian, it says, the Bible explains the existence of evil in this world is because of sin. It's because God created a world with order and structure and function that allows for good, but it also allows for bad. But the Bible gives you hope in the suffering, that God is going to show up. And so when you're talking to people, you need to help them see one of the best things you can offer them in a suffering world is the hope of the gospel. And they may not believe it, they may reject it, but it's the truth. It is the greatest hope for a suffering world is the gospel, the love and the promises in the scripture that come through faith in Jesus Christ. So I hope this podcast episode was helpful for you. We're going to continue on the next few episodes with other questions as they relate to God and evil. So thanks for tuning in today, and I hope you continue to watch.